So for this next section here, we're going to talk about how we're going to get our enemies to move and actually come towards you. For them to kind of patrol left and right is quite an easy process, but for the actual getting our enemies to pursue us directly, that takes a little bit more complicated code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly open up our enemy. I'm going to go to collision. Just check that I've definitely made that spherical, which is good. And I'm going to create a new event for my enemy, and that's going to be an update event, because we're always wanting it to try and pursue you. There may be circumstances that I might decide on later that might change that, so I'd probably add like an if function in, but we'll get into that in a little bit. What we'd want to do is have it that our enemies are wanting to move towards us, so we have to decide out of this section here what kind of movement we're wanting. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. The easiest way I've found so far to make this work, I know other ways to make this work, but the easiest way to explain it, I'm going to show you using this section of code here, which is using forces to move you in the direction of the player. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to move you over to Photoshop, and I'm going to give you kind of like an explanation of how we figure out which way the enemy is facing. Find out which way we want the enemy to travel. So I've got like this little doodle here. So we've got our spaceship, and we've got our enemy. Now the way that this works is we want to calculate which way we want our enemy to move. We usually use something along the lines of your x speed. So in the middle you've got your little alien spaceship thing. If it's not moving, it's at 0. If we want it to move left, we would use something like -10, and if we wanted it to move right, we would use something like 10. And that the same applies for -10 would be for moving upwards, and 10 would be for moving downwards. And that's great, but for us to dynamically change that, what we need to do is we need to take the position of the player, and we essentially need to deduct one off of the other. And what that does is that gives us a number that we can then input into our enemy to get it to move in the direction we want. So, for example, let's say our spaceship is at the position of, let's just add a little minus in there, and let's just wipe this clean real quick. There we go. So let's make this a little bit easier for ourselves so we don't have to draw a ship every time. So let's call this the ship, and let's call this the enemy. Or actually, let's do player, because then it can be applied to any situation. Okay. So player minus enemy. Let's say the player is at 10, and let's say our enemy is at 20. 10 minus 20, what number does that give you? I'll give you a quick second to figure that one out. It's -20. And if we use that as an x speed, that would send our enemy, that would send our enemy left, towards where the player was. As another example, still deducting the player from the enemy, let's say our enemy was at, I'm just trying to think of an example. So we just did 10 minus 20. So let's say our player was at 50 and our enemy was at 10. 50 minus 10 is 40. And that would send our enemy, it'd send it right, which is still in the direction of the player, but in this situation the player would be somewhere over here, if you get what I mean. I probably could have done some more space to explain this, but yeah, basically the way it works is by deducting the enemy's position off of the player, we can calculate like which way we want our enemy to move, which is a really useful piece of information. The only problem is the same issue we had before with the direction of the bullet, finding out the direction of the spaceship, is we need to send that piece of information from our spaceship to the mind of our enemy. So for that, as before, we need to create a game attribute. So, and we'd want to create this game attribute. I mean, it'll exist in all of our spaceships, so in all of our actors, but we want to specifically create it inside of our, this is for our spaceship to set. So we're going to go to attributes, and we're going to create 2 new attributes. The first one is going to be player X, and the second one is going to be player Y. And once again, we don't need to set these numbers to anything because we're going to set them automatically to whatever we're needing.